Welcome to Mindshift. I'm Brandon. Today is another Tuesday Takedown. Never of people, just of bad ideas, bad arguments, and bad apologetics. And that last one is exactly what we have today. We have some bad apologetics coming from Bishop Robert Barron. This is a short from a Christian YouTuber that we're going to take a look at, and then we're going to break it down line by line. We've had this theme going lately on the channel with the different ways that you can interpret and take the Bible. And what I think this clip exemplifies is the semantic play, the word play, the philosophical play that gets away from the text itself and allows anyone to create essentially anything about God. We see very plainly some very incorrect things being said here. So let's take a look at this clip.
Listen to Catholic Bishop Robert Barron explain why we've been asking the wrong question about what it means to believe in God.
We would say that God is not a being, but being itself. So the famous answer given to Moses, right? Ego sum qui sum, I am who I am. Moses is asking, what kind of being are you? He's trying to put God in categorical terms. And the answer there is so important because that makes all the difference when it comes to understanding religious language. Is if we follow Moses and his question, we will inevitably end up in atheism. Because if you think God is a categorical object in the world, eventually you'll say, well, I don't see this object and there's no evidence for it and I can explain the world without it. So that's why the answer of God in Exodus is so powerful, because he's saying, dumb question, wrong question. I'm not a thing in the world that you can name. I am who I am, which means I'm the prius, that's Augustine's language. I'm prior to thought and to language. I'm prior to being. I'm that upon which the categorical realm depends.
There's a lot here, and actually we're going to spend so much time on the very first sentence. So stick with me on this one. But even before that, the Christian YouTuber who put this together titled the video, "Catholic Bishop Dismantles Atheism." And that is just not what happened in this clip whatsoever. What is happening in this clip is a definition issue, a perception or conception issue of what is God, and seeing all of the different ways in which people interpret this God. The issue that I've come to realize is that they want all of them to exist together. Is God this thing that is outside space, outside time, prior to existence, prior to language and understanding, that is being itself and not a being? If that's the case, fine, but we shouldn't be able to see this God's effect on the world, which Christians constantly claim we do. This God shouldn't look like anything that has agency or decision or interference in this world, which is how the text reports him. This isn't then someone with whom we have a personal relationship, or you get the other side of that. You get a Father God who is the good shepherd and good parent, who sacrificed his son for us, that we can have an advocate for our original sin, that we are made in his image, all of these other ideas that are so obviously about a being, not being itself. And we won't even get into these two different definitions and the problems with them, right? Like up here, we have this very philosophical, ontological idea about God. What power should God have, etc. And to be honest, I don't care that much about this. This is kind of deism in general. This is kind of where the agnostic part of me is like, yeah, maybe there's something like that. But how disingenuous to try to tie that into Christianity and the claims that are made within Christianity about this second definition, the personal God. And we won't get into today about all the issues with why we wouldn't believe in this personal God, the mutually exclusive claims, the invalidity of the Bible, all the things we cover regularly on the channel. And sorry, my eye is watering all of a sudden. But the issue here is when you try to marry them together. That's when it all breaks down. Okay, we have this thing that is before time. We have this thing that somehow is special pleading to things having to come into existence. He is so powerful and sovereign that his will gets done. This is all his plan. But when mixing that with the personal God, we get things like divine hiddenness and the problem of evil and suffering. And so this semantic game that the bishop is playing here, where he's defeating atheism by pointing to this greater concept of being itself, really falls flat, and especially when we get to the verse that he's quoting. So I see this in a few parts. I'm going to lay out an agenda for us. First, I want to talk about that first sentence. Then we're going to look at the context of the verse he's using and why he is absolutely wrong. Then we're going to look at all the verses in the Bible that do show us that this God is the exact opposite of what the bishop is claiming. And then we can address some of his other points about how if you follow Moses's line of thinking here, it leads to atheism, etc. Just a lot of random statements and assertions that we'll cover pretty quickly say at the end. So let's dive in. Again, here's that first clip.
We would say that God is not a being, but being itself.
And here it looks like he's not even arguing that this God is both. This God, in his true nature, as he answers for himself to Moses, is that he is being itself, not a subject, not an individual, not a mind, not an owner of consciousness. I mean, essentially, this just describes God right out of existence. And some of the issue here is just this. It is that we are using words that seem to be open to interpretation themselves. Thus, when I said it's a semantic issue here, right? Like this all sounds really pretty. This is the same thing as when we listen to the bishop's excuse on hell. Like it's a lot of poetic and fluffy and philosophical language that ultimately ends up just completely, again, sorry for the repeated term, falling flat. But it's almost so vague that it can be hard to argue, and thus his targeted audience, people who just want to feel assured, people that just want to hear from a position of power, authority, or intellect that they are right, that the God they believe in is true, that atheism cannot be correct. And to that purpose, this kind of talking is really beneficial, which is why I find it so important to try to deconstruct. So I already alluded to these, but let's break it down into 3 quick parts: consciousness, intentionality, and agency, right? If God is just being itself rather than a being with consciousness, with awareness, whatever word you want to use here, that we would typically think of a being having, it challenges the very traditional and biblical understanding of this God. And you'll see in the verse that the bishop is using what a stretch he's making versus all of the other verses that we do have that show this God in an anthropomorphic way. Consciousness implies awareness, subjective existence or experience, and the capacity for thought and perception, all of which we see God doing in the Bible, by the way. If God lacks consciousness in this way, it simply raises questions about how this God interacts with the world at all. How could he even relate to sentient beings like humans without this capacity? Again, it challenges theological, biblical expectations about how this God communicates, whether it is through prophecy or divine revelation or written word or inspired written word, and all of the personal encounters that the prophets and patriarchs in the Bible had with this personal God, and all of the claimed personal encounters that Christians even today still assert that they have. Tied to this kind of awareness and consciousness is intentionality, the capacity for actions to be intended toward a desired goal or outcome or purpose or mission. Again, all of which we see in the Bible, and we're going to get to those examples. Without intentionality, why create? And now we've robbed ourselves of a God who has the desire or intention to create the world, to create beings that could reflect himself back to himself for glory and worship, let alone all of the other things this God has desired, has willed, again, according to the texts. And as for agency, according to the Bible, is God not an active participant in the affairs of this world? Does he, again, not have an end goal, an outcome that he wants, that he desires, that he thinks is more favorable? Does he not have the capacity to initiate action, to feel a certain way about things, to think a certain way about things, to do a certain thing in response to other things? Again, we have too many examples of this in the Bible to just place this God completely outside in the way that Bishop Robert Barron is trying to do. It seems to me that he is trying to remove God as to make an excuse for the lack of God that we see in this world. But you cannot have this both ways. I mean, just to be very clear, think about it. If God is just being itself and not an active being within this conception of reality, who are you praying to as a Christian? Essentially, the universe. If you don't believe that this God is a personal agent, then each and every prayer is wasted. If you don't believe that this God is a personal agent, then where is the personal relationship with it? If you don't believe this God is a personal agent, to what do you ascribe the witness of the Holy Spirit? Now, I can hear certain parts, again, of saying, Brandon, you're taking this a little too far. Clearly, he's saying this is the larger essence of God, but God has chosen to reveal reveal himself in a personal manner as to be able to connect with us lowly humans. Again, that is having your cake and eating it too. That is where the concept of being itself does not mix well with the limitations of a personal agent God. We get too many philosophical issues, we get too many things that do not marry, we get too many contradictions in nature. And again, if you listen to the way that Robert Barron is speaking here, he's telling Moses himself, you have it all wrong. I am not a categorical thing that you can just put into existence. I am beyond that. And the bishop is the one who chose to use Exodus. He's not talking about Jesus here and the duality of fully God and fully man and things like this. We're talking about the old school, Old Testament concept of Yahweh. That is who Moses was speaking to, correct? A being with a name who identifies himself with so many different names, by the way. So just living in the world of the example from the particular verse and time that the bishop is utilizing, we can see this God absolutely considers himself a personal being. So let's do this. Let's look at that verse more clearly from Exodus, and then let's look at other verses where this God describes himself instead of trying to listen to what the bishop is going to put on this God for us.
So the famous answer given to Moses, right? Ego sum qui sum. I am who I am. Moses is asking, what kind of being are you? He's trying to put God in categorical terms.
Except he's not trying to put God in categorical terms. Talk about missing the context. Let me fill you in. This comes from Exodus 3:14 specifically, but at the beginning of Exodus 3, we get Moses in the burning bush. So Moses is tending sheep for his father-in-law when he encounters a burning bush that is not being consumed by the fire. God speaks, which is already our first indication that this is a being, not being itself, calling Moses by name, asking him to remove his sandals, talking about the holy ground, all of these details and their implications. And it's fascinating. It is a fascinating theological study because it is an introduction to God, considering where Moses came from and the gods he would have believed in, and then even the family that he was connected to in his new life after his desertion. This is essentially the first time he is meeting, hearing about, learning intently about this God, and from the horse's mouth. So yes, I'm not taking light the theological implications of a God revealing himself to what many would consider to be the prophet, the man who spoke face to face with God like a friend, by the way. We'll get to that verse in a second. But yes, this is an intense passage. And by the way, to say there's even agreement on what I am means from this God is simply ridiculous. All kinds of theologians, all kinds of scholars, all kinds of biblical authority, all kinds of spiritual authorities, all kinds of denominations, etc., have not been able to agree on exactly what this statement means. Is it divine self-existence? Is it some kind of incomprehensibility or mystery? Some interpretations of this passage focus on the dynamic action and obvious presence of this God. Some, based off context and backing it up, look at the covenantal nature, and it is a God revealing his covenantal self or identity, and on and on and on. So again, for him to try to wrap this up so quickly as, oh, this is very evident and plain. Moses, a stupid human, was trying to put God in a box, and God said, don't put me in a box. Here's who I really am. And then the bishop extrapolates that into this impossible, untangible, unidentifiable essence of being itself that essentially ends up meaning nothing. But again, back to the context of the verse, I want to read you the verse that comes immediately before this. It is Exodus 3:13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? Then what shall I tell them? Okay, does anyone else see the dishonesty here? The very verse before the verse the bishop quotes is Moses stating exactly why he wants to know and better understand this God. It is to be able to have an answer to a particular group of people at a particular time because of a particular concern. We have the context, we understand from the Bible itself that the bishop is 100% incorrect and to a very unfair degree when he states that Moses is trying to put God in a category. The question that Moses asks clearly reflects Moses' concern about how to identify properly the identity of the sender of this divine commission. Nothing more, not some philosophical, ontological pursuit and quest for categorization. How disingenuous. And it's just so obvious how easy it becomes to play with the text, to play with the words, to make up meaning. And it sounded good, didn't it? But it's simply not biblical. End of story. Really, these Tuesday takedowns and reactions should look a lot more like he said this, and the verse right before what he quotes says this, and so that's not fair, and that's not true, and then I should drop it. But unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on who is watching, I like to expand. So let's get to verse 14 and talk about God's response. Response, also something that a being does, not being itself does. The thing that I think is funny or ironic here about God's response is it seems to be doing almost the exact opposite of what the bishop is asserting. I am what I am who I am that I am, all of the different ways that this has kind of been looked at. In response to, again, Moses' specific question about who do I tell the Israelites you are when they ask, was to reveal self-identification. It was to claim who he was as the personal God of the chosen people. Again, I don't know how else to say it except he defined God right out of existence, right out of meaning, right out of reality. And that is so opposite of the God we see all throughout the Bible that puts himself in front of his people, that shoves himself into their lives, that punishes and rewards them based off how real they take him. And by the way, a great opportunity for promotion here for me would be to say, watch my series called Dissecting the Divine, where we go through God on anatomy that specifically looks at all of the times, mainly in the Old Testament, where this God does claim physical existence, where the people who wrote the Bible, who originally believed in this God, who passed on the oral traditions, who wrote the poetry, who dictated the words that are now in our canon, saw this God so clearly as a personal being, active in the world, also in the heavenly realms, but with ears that really heard, not just poetically, with a mouth that really spoke, not just metaphorically, with legs and feet that really carried him to and fro, and every other aspect of what it is that we conceptualize a being to have, to be, to represent. And I think this might be a good time to go through a quick plethora of verses. Okay, let's rapid fire some of these off here. How about Genesis 18:1, the Lord appeared to Abraham. Exodus 33:11, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend. So the same book, the same characters, Moses and Yahweh. We get a report, albeit very inconsistent with the fact that no one can see God and live, where Moses speaks face to face with this God. How did Moses speak face to face like friends do with being itself? In Isaiah 41:10, we have God saying, I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. In Isaiah 66:13, as a mother comforts her child, so will I comfort you. Jeremiah 1:5, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Again, be thinking about this. Be thinking about God's physical traits and characteristics as I read them. Think about God's agency, his intellect, his intent, his consciousness, his will, all of these things that put him in properly the category of a being and not being itself. Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. Psalm 139, 1-2, you have searched me, Lord, and you know me. You know when I sit and when I rise, you perceive my thoughts from afar. Also in Exodus, also God with Moses, when my glory passes by, because he moves physically through time and space, I will put you in a cleft in the rock and cover you with my hand until I have passed. In Exodus 24:10, and saw the God of Israel, under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. Physical representations of this God. In Psalm 18:10, he parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. In Isaiah 59:1, surely the arm of the Lord is not too short to save, nor his ear too dull to hear. Isaiah 66:1, this is what the Lord says, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? Where will my resting place be? Look at all of this in this one verse. Heaven is my throne. So yes, even a spiritual transcendence area like heaven, sure, but it's what? A physical place where God resides, where he has his very physical thing, a throne. And what does he put his feet on? The earth itself. The earth is his footstool. Where is the house you will build for me? The temple, the house of the Lord, where God resides when he's on earth. Where will my resting place be? We have a God that rests from the very beginning in Genesis, even when he is before his creation. He is a being that, even if it's metaphorically, represents himself as resting. I mean, I could go, there's thousands of verses, and only for your benefit am I stopping myself, but we have a God who appears to his prophets, who walks with Adam and Eve in the garden, who didn't know where they were, whose footsteps could be heard, a God who walks and meets in tents with Abraham, who talks face to face with Moses and appears on mountaintops, who wrestles with Jacob, who becomes Israel, who appears in visions and dreams and represents himself through fulfilled prophecy, supposedly, let alone all of the New Testament things which clearly make this God a father. Just think about when Jesus gets baptized. What happens? The heavens open, the bird flies down, you can hear the voice of God taking pleasure in his son whom he loves. Even the very fact this God has a son. In what world do you get to just misrepresent through a complete miscontextualization of one verse in Exodus to create this God that you need outside of observable space and time as to make excuses for why the atheist fails when he says, it seems like we don't see and or then need this God in the world. So you just place him over here, what sounds like glory and magnificence, but ultimately fails because it becomes meaningless, and more than meaningless, becomes mutually exclusive to the rest of the way that everyone who wrote about and experienced this God portrays him. Pick a lane. Is this God so non-part of this world, so before it and outside of it, that we can't measure him, we can't see him, we can't pray to him, we can't experience his miracles or his presence or all of the things that every single Christian to some degree believes in? Oh, and I can move this now. Or is he a personal God who is supposed to reply to our prayers, who is supposed to will that none should be lost, who says ask and receive, who says have faith and be healed? But then when someone like me says, the Bible says to do this, or this, and we should be able to see God move like this, or this, and we don't, and thus maybe this particular God and his claims aren't true. The excuse to that is I'm too serious, I'm too literal, I'm trying to make this God too in space and in time. That's what this God tells us he is, and what his prophets again portray him to be. So I think I've beat a dead horse there, and I think we only have a little bit more to say. Let's see what the bishop said next.
If we follow Moses and his question, we will inevitably end up in atheism. Because if you think God is a categorical object in the world, eventually you'll say, well, I don't see this object and there's no evidence for it and I can explain the world without it.
I think you just said the quiet part out loud. We've already proven that Moses wasn't trying to put God in this categorical box. But even assuming he was, to think and question like Moses inevitably leads to atheism. I'm sorry, was Moses an atheist? Because at what point did Moses get corrected here? Moses still experienced God in this very personal way, which is supposedly against what God just represented himself correctly as to Moses. The rest of Moses' journey is one of still seeking after God, having conversation with God, whether it is through the tent of meaning or when God speaks out of his whirlwind or pillar of fire, or face to face like he does with a friend, or atop a mountain as he passes by. I mean, for heaven's sake, God buries Moses. How much more of a physical representation of a personal being do you need than for this very being to be the one that actually physically puts you in the dirt? Being a prophet that wants to hear specifically from God on how best to answer a question you know you're going to get does not inevitably lead you to atheism. Incorrect statement of the month right there. But why is this little straw man existing in the first place? That's the part he said out loud. He said, because if you think of God as this categorical object in the world, then eventually, by his own admission here, eventually you will say, where is he? I don't see him. I don't see his effect. It doesn't seem like we need him. He's right. And this is from his mouth. I didn't put these words in his mouth. It's just that his answer to that, to remove this God from the world, fails completely with, again, the Bible, the context of this particular verse he's basing it off of, and from the consistency of a philosophical standpoint. He goes on to kind of double down that that's why it's so important, because God's answer to Moses is dumb question, wrong question. God in no way alludes to that at all with his answer. Moses asks a very specific question, and within context of the conversation that he is having with this personal being, and then God gives him the answer to that. It is not corrective. We see God correct Moses. It doesn't look like this. And then he goes on to end it with just, I'm prior. I am the thing that comes before everything else. I am the thing of which all the categories depend on. And again, I want to be really clear. I am not trying to just be ridiculous here in my understanding of what the bishop is pointing to. But again, it's not exactly what he's saying. And he is saying parts here that are simply counter to that. So to me, again, what this sounds like, despite whatever other apologetic standpoints he has to mirror this or mix with this, is giving an answer against atheism by way of an example with Moses that is incorrect, with flowery language to say, I am what I am. You cannot pin me down. So when you think you can't find me, it's your fault because I'm beyond that. It boils down to the exact same thing as the verse that says, my ways are not your ways. My thoughts are higher. As some get out of jail free card, some complete cop out for why we don't see God in this world. And that would be fine if that's the kind of God that the Bible describes. But as we have shown here today, that is not the kind of God. We are supposed to rely on a personal Savior. We are supposed to believe that we were made with purpose and intent, with, as this very bishop would even say elsewhere, inherent dignity, because we are the creation of the Creator, made in his image. You can't have that if your excuse is he's outside of all of that. That's the whole point. That's the entire video. So thank you so much for being here. Thank you for watching. We have next up our very last book of the Bible this coming Thursday for Secular Bible Study Series. I cannot wait and am also completely overwhelmed by getting to the New Testament. But that's what's next. So until then, keep thinking. I wanted to personally thank all of my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast, Anne, Boris, GVI, Jacob, Joe, Martin, Oliver, Perry, Rokkit, and Shawn, my Humanist heroes, Jarrod and Kristi, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, Imposter, Jeff, Jeffrey, Karen, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my Secular Scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.